Imagine standing on the gray, windswept beaches of Dunkirk in June 1940. You are looking at the wreckage of an empire. The British Expeditionary Forces just pulled off a miraculous evacuation, but they have left almost everything behind. Burning trucks, abandoned artillery, and mountains of small arms litter the sand. The British Army is alive, but it is naked. Across the Channel, the German war machine is gearing up for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England. They are armed with a precise, terrifying MP-40 submachine gun. The British? They have almost nothing. If the Germans land tomorrow, the Home Guard will be fighting them with shotguns, pikes, and cricket bats. In this moment of existential dread, a weapon is born not out of genius, but out of sheer, panic-induced necessity. It looks like a piece of plumbing. It rattles when you shake it. It costs less than a pair of good shoes. It is a Sten Gun, the weapon that every soldier claimed to hate, yet the weapon that would ultimately save Europe. Before we dismantle the myth of this stamped metal icon, make sure you lock onto that subscribe button and trigger the notification bell, because you need to know how a $5 piece of junk managed to outlast a Third Reich. The story of the Sten Gun does not begin in a high-tech laboratory or prestigious design bureau. It begins in the shadow of defeat. Following the Dunkirk evacuation, the British Army conducted a horrifying inventory check. They had lost nearly 2,500 heavy guns, 64,000 vehicles, and over 75,000 tons of ammunition. But most critically, they had lost their automatic firepower. The standard British infantry tactic relied heavily on the Bren light machine gun, a beautifully machined, accurate, and expensive weapon. But Brens took time to build, and time was the one resource Britain did not have. Churchill was sending desperate cables to Roosevelt, pleading for arms, but the American Thompson submachine gun, the famous Tommy gun, was a luxury item. It cost nearly $200 a unit, roughly the price of a decent car at the time, and required complex machining that British factories, already being bombed by the Luftwaffe, simply could not replicate its speed. The War Office was staring into the abyss. They needed a submachine gun, a weapon that could spray 9mm bullets at close range, perfect for the street fighting they anticipated when the Nazis marched on London. They didn't need it to be accurate beyond 100 yards. They didn't need it to be pretty. They needed it to be cheap, and they needed millions of them, instantly. Enter Major Reginald V. Shepard and Mr. Harold J. Turpin of the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. It was late 1940. The air raid sirens were a daily soundtrack to their work. Shepard and Turpin looked at the captured German MP-40 and the expensive American Thompson and decided to throw the rulebook into the furnace. They realized that in a total war, craftsmanship was a liability. The weapon they sketched out was an affront to traditional gunsmithing. It was essentially a tube with a spring in it. The name Sten was a contraction, S for Shepard, T for Turpin, and EN for Enfield. In early 1941, the first prototype emerged. It was crude, comprised of just 4 to 7 parts. For context, most firearms of the era had hundreds of moving components. The Sten was designed to be built not by gunsmiths, but by anyone with a stamp press and a welding torch. This was a revolutionary concept that terrified the British military establishment as much as it delighted the accountants. The receiver wasn't milled from a solid block of steel, a process that took hours. It was a simple steel tube. The trigger mechanism was a stamped metal box welded to the bottom. The barrel was a simple rifle pipe. When the military brass first laid eyes on the Sten Mark I, they were appalled. It looked unfinished. It had a crude conical flash hider and a folding wooden foregrip that felt flimsy. But then they looked at the price tag. A Thompson submachine gun cost the British government roughly £40 to import. The projected cost of a Sten? £2.50. For the price of one American Tommy gun, the British could arm a nearly entire platoon with Stens. The economic logic was undeniable. The order was given to mass-produce the weapon immediately, but even the simplified Mark I was deemed too complex for the urgency of the moment. Shepard and Turpin went back to the drawing board and stripped it down even further, resulting in the most famous and infamous variant, the Sten Mark II. The Mark II, introduced in 1942, is a silhouette burned into history. They removed the flash hider. They replaced the wooden furniture with a simple metal skeleton stock that looked like a bent coat hanger. They simplified the barrel shroud into a perforated metal sleeve. This was a plumber's nightmare. It was ugly, cold to the touch, and looked like something assembled in a garage, which, in many cases, it was. To achieve the massive numbers required, the British government decentralized production. This is where the story of the Sten becomes the story of the British people. Production wasn't limited to the Royal Small Arms factories. They subcontracted the parts to anyone with a workshop. Toy makers, washing machine manufacturers, and lipstick case factories began churning out springs, bolts, and barrels. These parts were then sent to central assembly points. A worker making the trigger housing in a shed in Birmingham might never see the barrel being made in a converted garage in Manchester. This dispersal strategy was brilliant for two reasons. First, it made the production lines bomb-proof. The Luftwaffe could flatten a massive factory at Enfield, but they couldn't bomb 10,000 backyard workshops scattered across the island. Second, it engaged the entire civilian workforce. But it also led to the Sten's legendary reliability issues. When you have parts made by hundreds of different suppliers with varying degrees of quality control, tolerances stack up. A bolt from Factory A might be a fraction of a millimeter too tight for a receiver from Factory B. By the time the Sten reached the hands of British soldiers in late 1941 and 1942, the rumors were already flying. Soldiers picked it up and laughed. It felt unbalanced. The magazine stuck out to the left side horizontally, a bizarre design choice that was meant to allow soldiers to fire while lying prone, hugging the ground. But this side-mounted magazine caused the gun to pull to the left as it emptied, throwing off aim. The sights were crude, fixed pieces of metal that were useless beyond 50 yards. But the real horror stories came from the safety mechanism, or lack thereof. The Sten operated on a simple blowback open bolt system. To ready the weapon, you pulled the heavy bolt handle back until it locked into a notch cut into the receiver tube. When you pulled the trigger, the massive bolt flew forward under spring tension, stripped a round from the magazine, chambered it, and the fixed firing pin on the face of the bolt struck the primer, detonating the cartridge. The explosion blew the bolt back, ejecting the shell, and the cycle repeated. It was primitive physics. The danger lay in the open bolt design. If a soldier dropped a loaded Sten gun with the bolt forward, closed, on a live round, the inertia of the impact could jar the bolt back just enough to pick up a round, but not enough to lock the safety, and then the spring would slam it forward, firing the weapon. This became known as a Sten Dance. A drop gun would hit the floor and start firing wildly in a circle, emptying its 32-round magazine as soldiers dug for cover. British troops quickly learned to walk on eggshells around the thing. They nicknamed it the Sten Gun. They joked that it was the only weapon in the world that you could fix by kicking it. The Sten's combat debut was disastrous, cementing its poor reputation early on. During the Deep Raid in August 1942, Canadian troops armed with Stens stormed the beaches of occupied France. In the sand and grit of the beach, the Stens began to jam. The open slot on the side of the receiver where the cocking handle moved was a magnet for date. If mud got into the tube, the bolt wouldn't cycle. Soldiers were found dead with stripped-down Stens in their hands, desperately trying to clear jams while under fire. The tragic failure at Deep seemed to confirm the worst fears. Britain had sent its boys to die with a toy gun. However, the narrative of the Sten is not one of failure, but of adaptation. As the war progressed, the British Army began to understand what the Sten actually was. It wasn't a rifle. It wasn't a precision instrument. It was a hose. In the close quarters fighting that defined the liberation of Europe, clearing rooms, fighting in hedgerows, and ambushing convoys, precision didn't matter as much as volume of fire. The Sten fired at a rate of 500 rounds per minute. At 10 yards, it was devastating. The weapon found its true calling not just with the regular army, but with the chaotic, shadowy world of the resistance. The Special Operations Executive, OSOE, realized the Sten was the perfect guerrilla weapon. It could be disassembled into 3 parts, the stock, the receiver, and the barrel, and hidden in a remarkably small bag. It was light. It used 9mm ammunition, which was crucial because that was a standard German pistol and submachine gun round. If a resistance fighter ran out of British ammo, he could raid a German truck and use captured bullets. This logistical compatibility was a stroke of accidental genius. Beginning in 1942, the IAF began dropping containers filled with Stens to resistance groups across France, Norway, Denmark, and Poland. For a French partisan who had never held a gun before, the Sten was a godsend. It required almost no training. Point the tube at the Nazi, pull the trigger, and hold on tight. It was the great equalizer. The psychological impact of the Sten on the German occupiers was immense. The harsh, metallic asterisk clack 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 asterisk of a Sten firing became the sound of the resistance. It meant the enemy was everywhere, armed with weapons that could be built in cellar. Perhaps the most dramatic moment in the Sten's history, a moment that encapsulates both its fatal flaws and its historic necessity, occurred on May 27, 1942, in Prague. Operation Anthropoid. Two Czechoslovak soldiers, Joseph Gabčík and Jan Kubis, trained by the British SOE, were sent to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, the butcher of Prague and the architect of the Holocaust. As Heydrich's open-top Mercedes slowed around a hairpin turn, Gabčík stepped out into the road. He raised his Sten gun, aimed directly at Heydrich from a few feet away, and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun jammed. It was the quintessential Sten moment. The cheap, stamped metal had failed at the critical second. Gabčík froze. Heydrich stood up to shoot back. It was only because Kubis threw a modified anti-tank grenade that the mission succeeded, wounding Heydrich, who later died of infection. The jam nearly cost them the mission and led to a horrific manhunt, but it highlighted the gamble the British took with a weapon. It was good enough to get them there, even if it wasn't perfect. Back in Britain, the drive to make the weapon even cheaper continued. The Mark III was introduced, the crudest of the bunch. The receiver and the barrel shroud was stamped from a single sheet of metal and welded along the top. It was a disposable gun for a disposable war. They stopped bothering to finish the weld smoothly. They didn't paint them. They used a chemical blackening process that looked like soot. But by 1943, production was soaring. Millions of Stens were flooding the theater. The sheer quantity began to have a quality of its own. Soldiers in the field began to develop Sten craft. They learned that the magazine was the weak point. The double-stack, single-feed design was prone to friction. If you loaded the full 32 rounds, the spring was too tight, and the first round would often fail to feed. Experienced sergeants told their men, only load 28. They learned never to hold a magazine as a grip, even though it looked like one, because pulling on it misaligned the feed lips and caused jams. They held a perforated barrel shroud, often burning their hands during prolonged firefights, leading to the Sten grimace. Despite the complaints, the Sten began to rack up victories. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where visibility was often less than 20 meters, the Sten was superior to the bolt-action Lee-Enfield rifle. A British patrol could unleash a wall of lead instantly. The British airborne troops, the Red Devils, embraced the weapon. For a paratrooper, weight is everything. Jumping out of a plane with a heavy rifle is awkward. Jumping with a Sten strapped to your chest is manageable. By 1944, a new variant appeared that signaled the shifting tides of the war. The Sten Mark V. The British were no longer desperate. They were winning. The Mark V was a gentleman's Sten. It had a wooden pistol grip, a wooden stock, and a bayonet lug. It had better sights. The finish was of a higher quality. This was a weapon carried by the paratroopers into Arnhem during Operation Market Garden. It was still a Sten, still a tube with a spring, but it had been refined by years of combat experience. The ubiquity of the Sten gun also led to some ingenious, if terrifying, modifications. The most notable was the Sten Mark II, S, and Mark VI. These were silenced versions. The barrel was ported and surrounded by a massive suppressor filled with baffles and rubber washers. Combined with subsonic ammunition, the silent Sten was whisper-quiet. The mechanical clatter of the bolt moving back and forth was louder than the shot itself. These were the weapons of the commandos and the SAS. They were used to take out sentries during night raids, silent killers in the dark. However, the silencer heated up so fast that a canvas cover had to be laced around it so the operator could hold it without searing their skin. As the Allies pushed into Germany, the Sten gun's reputation underwent a transformation. It went from being the plumber's nightmare to a badge of honor. It was the weapon of the liberator. When British troops entered a French village, the sight of the ugly, skeleton-stuck gun signaled freedom. It was a symbol of British stubbornness. It was ugly, it was cheap, and it worked just enough to get the job done. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Sten's history is how the Germans reacted to it. Initially, they mocked it. They compared it to their finely machined MP40s and laughed at the British for fielding such junk. But as the war turned against Germany and their own resources began to dwindle, the laughter stopped. In the final months of the war, desperate for weapons to arm the Volksturm militia, the Germans actually copied the Sten. They created the Gerät Potsdam and the MP 3008, direct clones of the British design. The irony was palpable. The nation of precision engineering was reduced to copying the British plumbing pipe because it was the only design efficient enough to keep up with the apocalypse of 1945. The Sten Gun remained in service long after the surrender of Germany. It was the weapon of the Jewish paramilitaries in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It saw action in the Korean War. It was used in the Milan Emergency. It ended up in Vietnam. Because it was so easy to make, it became the blueprint for insurgent weapons worldwide. You can still find Sten copies being hammered together in workshops in Khyber Pass today. But its true legacy lies in those dark years of 1940 to 1942. The Sten Gun proves a vital lesson in warfare and engineering. Perfect is the enemy of good. If Britain had waited to design a perfect submachine gun, or if they had insisted on the craftsmanship of the pre-war era, they would have been overrun. The Sten was a triumph of logistics over aesthetics. It cost, at its peak efficiency, about 10 shillings to make, the equivalent of a few dollars. Over 4 million Stens were produced during the war. Think about that number. 4 million. That is 4 million soldiers, resistance fighters, and partisans armed with automatic weaponry. It saturated the battlefield. It allowed the British Army to transform from a WWI-style force of riflemen into a modern force capable of mobile, high-volume fire. When you look at a Sten gun in a museum today, it looks unimpressive. The welds are messy. The metal is stamped and scratched. It looks like it belongs in a scrap heap. But pause and look closer. That crude loop of steel stock, that pipe-like receiver, that awkward side-sticking magazine, that is a physical manifestation of a nation's will to survive. It is the embodiment of the phrase, by any means necessary. The soldiers who carried it called it the stench, the plumber's abortion, and the Woolworth special. They cursed at it when it jammed and swore at it when it accidentally discharged. But when the enemy was 10 feet away and coming through the door, and that ugly little tube spat out 30 rounds of 9mm hell in 3 seconds, they loved it. It was the ultimate cheap weapon, a piece of industrial brutality that helped break the back of fascism. To understand the true magnitude of this industrial miracle, you have to look past the battlefield and into the factory floors where the Sten was born. This weapon was the ultimate triumph of the total war philosophy. It wasn't just that the gun was cheap, it was that it democratized production of violence. Before the Sten, gunsmithing was an art form reserved for skilled craftsmen with decades of experience. The Sten smashed that tradition to pieces. By late 1942, the people manufacturing the weapon that would liberate Europe were not gunsmiths. They were former hairdressers, housewives, and grocery clerks working in converted facilities. The Singer Sewing Machine Company in Clydebank, Scotland, famously turned its production lines from stitching fabric to stamping out triggers and bolts. There's a profound irony in that image. The same machinery that once clothed the nation was now arming it. The tolerances were loose, the finish was rough, and the welds looked like scars, but every single unit that rolled off that line was a middle finger to the Nazi war machine. This mass production ethos, however, bred a unique culture of superstition among the troops. Because the parts were made in different shops and assembled hastily, every Sten had its own personality. Some were sweet, cycling smoothly through thousands of rounds without a hiccup. Others were dogs, prone to jamming on every third round. A seasoned sergeant could tell you that you didn't pick a Sten by looking at it. You picked it by shaking it. If it rattled too much, the searing was loose. If it didn't rattle enough, the grit would bind the bolt. You wanted a Goldilocks rattle, a specific metallic clatter that meant the tolerances were loose enough to eat mud, but tight enough to fire. This loose construction was a double-edged sword that defined the infantryman's daily life. In the thick mud of the Italian campaign or the flooded fields of the Netherlands, the Sten's open architecture was a constant anxiety. The slot on the side of the receiver, where the cocking handle traveled back and forth, was a gaping wound in the gun's defense against the elements. If you crawled through a ditch in that slot filled with clay, your submachine gun became a 3-pound club. Soldiers innovated on the fly. They wrapped the receivers in oily rags, old socks, or canvas gaiters, untying them only when combat was imminent. It was a weapon that required constant babysitting, a stark contrast to the sealed, robust nature of the bolt-action Lee Enfield. Yet, in the claustrophobic nightmare of urban combat, these flaws evaporated. When the British Army hit the streets of Cohen and Ortona, the war changed. It was no longer about marksmanship at 500 yards across a green field. It was about mouse-holing, blowing a hole through a living room wall and storming the next house. In a room 12 feet square, a long rifle was a hindrance. You couldn't swing it around a doorframe. But the Sten? You could tuck the stock under your arm, kick the door, and spray the room from the hip. The spray-and-pray tactic, often derided by traditionalists, was the only thing that kept men alive in those stairwells. The 9mm round didn't have the kinetic energy of a rifle bullet, but it didn't need to. It just needed to suppress the enemy long enough for a grenade to do the rest. The Sten turned every infantryman into a stormtrooper. The psychological effect of the weapon extended to its sound. Unlike the sharp *crack* of a supersonic rifle round, the Sten emitted a harsh, flat *chug noise, often described by veterans as sounding like a tractor backfiring. It was an ugly sound, distinct from the faster *zip* of the German MP-40. In the confused hedgerows of Normandy, sound was information. That distinct mechanical chug allowed British units to identify each other in the dark. It became the heartbeat of the advance. However, we cannot ignore the weapon's most critical failing, the feature that likely caused as many casualties as the enemy, the magazine. The Sten used a 32-round double-stack, single-feed magazine. This was a direct copy of the magazine from the Lanchester submachine gun, which was itself a copy of the German MP-28. It was a terrible design choice. The single feed meant that the two columns of bullets had to merge into a single line at the top of the magazine to enter the gun. This created a friction point. If any dirt got into the magazine, or if the feed lips at the top were bent even a millimeter, which happened constantly given the cheap sheet metal construction, the friction would overcome the spring, and the gun would jam. Soldiers quickly learned that the magazine was the heart of the problem. They treated their magazines like gold dust. If they found a magazine that fed reliably, they marked it and guarded it with their lives. They learned never to load the full 32 rounds, stopping at 28 or 29 to reduce the tension on the spring. And crucially, they learned never to use a magazine as a foregrip. The natural instinct when holding the gun is to grab the magazine sticking out the side for stability. But doing so applied torque to the feed lips, causing a misalignment that guaranteed a jam. The training manual screamed, "Hold the barrel shroud." But in the heat of battle, instinct often took over, leading to the terrifying *click* of a misfeed when a *bang* was needed most. Despite these mechanical terrors, the Sten had one final, unexpected virtue. It was disposable. In previous wars, a soldier was expected to care for his rifle for years. It was serial numbered to him. If he lost it, he was court-martialed. The Sten changed the economics of equipment. If a Sten was damaged, or if a retreating unit needed to move fast, they didn't bother trying to save them. They smashed them against trees or pulled the bolts and threw the tubes into a river. There were plenty more coming. This disposability allowed for a tactical fluidity the British had never possessed. They could drop them to partisans, leave them behind for rearguard units, or cache them in buried drums for future insurgencies without denting the war budget. This philosophy of quantity has a quality all its own reached its zenith during the airborne operations of 1944. When the gliders landed at Pegasus Bridge or the paratroopers dropped into the forests of the Ardennes, they were often carrying the Sten Mark V. This was a deluxe model, appearing late in the war. It was an attempt to civilize a beast. They added a wooden pistol grip and a wooden stock, acknowledging that perhaps soldiers fought better when their weapon didn't feel like a piece of scaffolding. They even added a bayonet lug, a darkly comic addition for a submachine gun. The idea of fixing a bayonet to a short-barreled automatic weapon and charging a machine gun nest speaks to the aggressive spirit the British airborne fostered. The Mark V became the iconic weapon of the Red Devils, immortalized in the desperate street fighting of Arnhem. There, amidst the rubble of the bridge too far, the Sten proved that even with a wooden stock, it was still a brawler. It functioned when the supplies were cut off, scavenging German 9mm ammunition from captured stocks, keeping the perimeter alive hour after hour. As the war in Europe ground to a halt in May 1945, the British Army found itself with millions of these metal tubes. The immediate question was what to do with them. A weapon built for desperate defense and chaotic liberation is not necessarily the weapon you want for a peacetime standing army. The British moved quickly to replace the Sten with the Sterling submachine gun, a weapon that looked similar but was built to the high standards of traditional engineering. The Sterling was everything the Sten should have been: reliable, ergonomic, and safe. But the transition took time, and the Sten lingered. The afterlife of the Sten is perhaps as fascinating as its wartime service. Because it was so simple to manufacture, the blueprint spread like a virus. It became the quintessential weapon of the anti-colonial movements that swept the globe in the late 1940s and 50s. In the jungles of Malaya, British troops found themselves being fired upon by communist insurgents wielding Stens that had been left behind or copied in local workshops. In the Middle East, during the violent birth of the State of Israel, the Haganah produced their own unauthorized copies of the Sten to fight both the British and the Arab armies. It is a supreme historical irony that the British soldiers in Palestine were often killed by copies of the very weapon their own country had designed to save civilization. The plumber's nightmare had escaped the lab, and it could not be put back in the box. The design principles of the Sten, the stamped metal, the telescoping bolt, the utter simplicity, influenced the next generation of firearms. You can see the DNA of the Sten in the American M3 grease gun, another stamped steel ugly duckling. You can see it in the early prototypes of the Israeli Uzi. Uziel Gal, the designer of the Uzi, studied the Sten closely. He saw the genius in the stamped metal construction but also recognized the fatal flaw of the side-mounted magazine and the safety issues. The Uzi is essentially a Sten gun that went to university. It took the cheap manufacturing ethos and applied proper engineering rigor to it. But beyond the mechanics and the geopolitics, the legacy of the Sten is emotional. It represents a specific moment in British history where making do was the difference between life and death. It strips away the romance of war. A bolt-action rifle with a worn-out stock suggests a duel, a contest of skill. A Sten gun suggests a brawl in an alleyway. It admits the brutal truth that war is messy, industrial, and close. Today, if you dig into the soil of Normandy or scour the riverbeds near Arnhem, you will still find them. Rusted husks of steel tubing, the springs long since rotted away. They are the archaeological footprints of a desperate time. They remind us that victory wasn't bought with wonder weapons or jet engines. It was bought with £2.50 worth of steel and the courage of the men who held it. The Sten gun was never a good weapon. By any objective metric of firearms design, accuracy, ergonomics, safety, it was a disaster. But it was the *right weapon. It arrived exactly when it was needed, in the numbers required, at a price that could be paid. It was a plumber's nightmare that cleared the blockage of tyranny from Europe. So, the next time you hear someone dismiss cheap engineering, remind them of the Sten. Remind them that sometimes the crude solution is the only one that works. Remind them that a nation of shopkeepers, armed with tools made by sewing machine operators, outproduced and outfought the master engineers of the Third Reich. The Sten gun didn't just shoot bullets. It shot holes in the idea that perfection is a prerequisite for victory. And for that reason, this ugly, rattling, dangerous piece of pipe deserves its place in the pantheon of legends.